On the night Velma Middleton stopped singing forever, the crowd in Freetown thought she was dancing too hard. She went down mid-number, right leg first, then her whole side, and for one long moment, nobody in that packed hall moved. Not the band, not the promoters, not the American ambassador in the third row. By the time anyone reached her, the woman Louis Armstrong trusted more than almost anyone else on the stage could no longer lift her right arm. What a 22-year-old student nurse did for her over the next 27 days, in a hospital with no one else who knew her name, is a story the Armstrong Band carried home in silence. Freetown, Sierra Leone, January 14th, 1961. Hill Station Hospital, 3 miles from the harbor. Rewind 4 months, and none of it looks like tragedy yet. It looks like the best tour Louis Armstrong had ever played. Velma Middleton had been standing beside Louis Armstrong on stage since 1942, 19 years by the time the plane touched down in Africa. Longer than most of the men in his band had known him. She sang the duets. She did the splits that made grown men in tuxedos gasp. She was the one who could make Louis laugh mid-song without either of them missing a beat, and the one he trusted to carry a scene when his lip needed 30 seconds of rest. "She's not my singer," Louis told a reporter once, waving off the word like smoke. "She's my partner." By late 1960, the United States State Department had sent him across Africa as Ambassador Satch, a goodwill tour through country after country, 30,000 people in one stadium, a king's motorcade in another. In the Congo, where 2 political factions had been shooting at each other for weeks, both sides agreed to a 24-hour ceasefire so the fighting wouldn't interrupt his concert in Leopoldville. That was the size of what this tour had become. Nobody in the band, least of all Velma, was going to be the one to say they needed to slow down. The schedule was brutal anyway. 2 shows some nights, red-eye flights, no real rest between borders, new mosquito nets and new water and new stages in a new country almost every week. Louis was 60. Velma was 43, and heavier than she used to be, and for months, Louis had quietly worried about her. Before the tour began, he'd made her an offer nobody outside the band ever heard about. 6 months of full salary paid in advance if she'd stay home and rest instead of boarding that plane. Velma turned him down. "I'm going where you're going," she said. "That's the whole job." Adama Cisse was 22 years old and 11 months into her nurse's training at Hill Station Hospital when the American singer was carried through the doors on a stretcher, her right side gone slack, her eyes wide open and frightened. Adama had never heard of Velma Middleton. She knew Louis Armstrong's name the way most of Freetown did that week, from the posters of his face on King Street, from a trumpet sound leaking out of a radio in the nurses' quarters 2 nights earlier. She had wanted, since she was 14, to become a matron, to run a ward the way the strictest sister at Hill Station ran hers, with a clipboard and a temper and total command of every bed. She had never had an American patient. She had certainly never had a famous one. "Talk to her like she's not famous," the ward sister told her that first night, handing Adama the chart. "Talk to her like she's someone's mother, because right now, that's all she is." Adama nodded and did not entirely understand yet how long that job would last. The collapse itself had come in stages, the way the doctors later reconstructed it for the file. First, mid-song, Her right leg buckled, a stumble the audience half laughed at, thinking it was part of the act. Then her right arm stopped answering her at all, the microphone dropping from fingers that no longer closed around it. Then, as two bandmates caught her under the arms and carried her off, her mouth moved and no words came out. Not the leg, not the arm, the voice. For 19 years, on 100 stages, Velma Middleton had always had a next line ready. That night, for the first time, there wasn't one. Louis Armstrong reached the wings before she was even fully off the stage, his horn still in one hand. He knelt beside her on the floor of the wing, calling her name, and for the first time in 19 years, Velma Middleton did not answer him back. The promoter wanted the show to continue. Louis played the second half that night with Velma's chair empty at the side of the stage, exactly where she always sat between numbers. He did not have it removed. Band members said later he looked at it more than he looked at the crowd. The doctors at Hill Station gave the diagnosis within 2 days: a stroke, paralysis down her right side, and, this was the part that frightened the touring party most, no way to know yet if she would ever fly home. Joe Glazer, Louis's manager, worked the phones from New York, trying to bend the tour's remaining dates around a woman who could not be moved. He could not do it. Contracts had been signed in 6 more countries. Halls had been sold out for weeks. The State Department itself had a schedule to keep, and Ambassador Satch was not a role Louis Armstrong could simply set down. "The show must go on," Louis told the band, the phrase every one of them had heard him say 100 times before, except this time, nobody in the room believed he meant it the way he used to. He sat with her the morning before he left, the way he had every morning since the collapse, and he told her he'd call the hospital from every city on the schedule to check on her. He kept that promise. The calls came in at odd hours, routed through a hotel switchboard and then a hospital one, and every time a dama or another nurse would have to explain, again, that Velma still could not come to the phone herself. He left Velma Middleton in a hospital bed in Freetown and boarded the next flight to the next country on the schedule. Adama Sese was assigned to her room full-time. 27 days. Nobody from the band was in the building most of that time. Adama was. 3 weeks in, going through the small suitcase Velma had brought from the hotel, looking for a nightgown, nothing more, Adama found a folded piece of hotel stationery tucked inside a stocking. It was a note in Louis's handwriting, dated months before the tour, offering Velma 6 months' pay to stay home. Adama couldn't have known what it meant without the Ward sisters' help translating the American slang scrawled at the bottom, but she understood the date, and she understood, holding it, that the woman in the bed had known this trip might cost her everything, and had climbed onto the plane anyway. She did not tell Velma she had found it. Velma could no longer speak to be told anything. What Adama did instead was smaller, and it was the only power she had. She read the note aloud to her, once, quietly, the way you'd read a letter to someone who could still hear, even if she couldn't answer. Then she folded it back into the suitcase exactly where she'd found it, and she kept coming back every night after her shift ended, unpaid, unasked, until the 27th day. There was a routine to it by then. Adama would finish her rounds on the other beds, then pull a chair to Velma's side and describe the ordinary things of her own day. The heat on King Street, a fight she'd overheard between 2 orderlies, A letter from her mother in Beau. Velma couldn't answer any of it, but her eyes tracked Adama around the room, and once, when Adama hummed a few bars of a tune she'd heard leaking from the nurse's radio, Velma's left hand, the one that still worked, tapped twice against the sheet, in time. Velma Middleton died in that hospital bed on February 10, 1961, without ever leaving Sierra Leone. Adama was on the ward when it happened. The telegram reached Louis Armstrong on tour in the middle of the schedule Joe Glazer had been unable to break. He did not perform that night. Band members who were there said it was the only cancellation of the entire Africa tour. Izzy Rowe, a journalist covering the tour for the Pittsburgh Courier, wrote the line that ran in papers across America that week. In more ways than one, she gave her life for the profession she loved. The funeral was held on February 21, 1961, at Convent Avenue Baptist Church in New York City. Louis Armstrong was not there. He was still on tour, still honoring the contracts that had kept him from her hospital bed, still playing the horn every night to houses that had no idea what he was carrying with him from Freetown. Joe Glazer sent flowers on Louis's behalf and a telegram to be read at the service. Band members who made it back for the funeral said the church was full. Musicians, dancers, people from 3 decades of Velma's career, all of them aware that the one man who probably should have been in the front pew was thousands of miles away, working. Because that was the arrangement none of them had ever managed to change in time. For years afterward, people who worked the Armstrong shows said there was a certain number in the set, a slow blues Velma used to sing the second half of, that Louis stopped performing almost entirely. When he did play it, band members said, he played it a half-step softer than everything around it, and never introduced it the way he introduced everything else. In interviews for the rest of the decade, whenever a reporter worked up the nerve to ask about the Africa tour, Louis would talk happily about the Congo ceasefire, about the crowds, about the horns of welcome at every airport, and then, almost every time, without being asked directly, he'd bring the conversation back around to Velma on his own. 19 years, he told one interviewer, and I never once had to look over to see was she there. She was always there. He said it the way a man says something he has decided to keep saying so that it stays true. Adama Sese finished her training at Hill Station Hospital later that year. She did become a matron eventually, just as she'd planned since she was 14, though for the rest of her working life, whenever a foreign patient came through her ward, frightened and far from home, she gave the same instruction to her junior nurses that had once been given to her. Talk to them like they're someone's mother, because right now, that's all they are. She never met Louis Armstrong in person. He never learned her name. There was no reunion, no letter exchanged between Freetown and Corona. No moment where the two people who had cared most for Velma Middleton in her final month ever spoke to one another about it. That absence was its own kind of truth about the story. Most of the people who carry the weight of a moment like this are never in the room with each other at all. Hill Station Hospital still stands above Freetown Harbor today, the same 3 miles from the water it was in 1961. There is no plaque on the building for the American singer who spent her final 27 days in one of its wards, and there never was one. And the hospital staff who remember the story at all remember it the way Adama told it, as something that happened to an ordinary young nurse assigned an extraordinary patient, not as history. What stayed with everyone who was in Freetown that January, and with everyone who has heard the story since, is the shape of the choice Velma Middleton made months before she ever boarded that plane. She was offered a way out, full pay, no shame, no explanation required, and she said no, because the job, to her, was standing beside Louis Armstrong wherever he went. 19 years had taught her that showing up was the whole point of who she was. It cost her the last month of her life. She never once, by any account left behind, said she regretted it. Louis Armstrong outlived her by 10 years, and by every account from the men who toured with him, he never stopped keeping that empty chair in mind. If a story like this one stayed with you, consider subscribing for more of these hidden histories. And tell us in the comments, have you ever cared for a stranger the way Adama cared for Velma, staying long after anyone asked you to?